everybody has this thinking, which is, hey, tell me a bullet list of things I should look for in my mentor, or tell me how to do X. And they expect you to give them like a checklist. Okay, look for this, look for this, look for this. What I've found in my life is it's very hard to describe great things in bullet points. You have to experience greatness to understand what greatness even means.
Hi, Sanchan. Thank you so much for coming on to the show today.
I'm excited to be here and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. So you had quite a career. So now you're the VP of Coinbase. Previously, you work at like a lot of iconic products such as Airbnb and Instagram. To start off the show, I would love to, go back to your childhood a little bit. You were originally from India. You studied aerospace engineering and you tried entrepreneurship. Now you're in the US. So to start off the show, I would love for you to share with the audience how you started and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, happy to. I came to the US in 2007. Actually, I came to Silicon Valley in 2007. I came to the US in 2005. In Silicon Valley, as you mentioned, I've been very fortunate to have worked with some great founders and some great companies, and I've learned a lot during that time. But it wasn't always a straight line from where I was born and where I was raised and where I grew up. I will take us back in time when I lived in the small town called Saharanpur in India. Fun fact, I did not know how to speak in English until the age of like 11 or 12. I did not know because I studied in schools that taught math and science in local languages. So it was a fun upbringing, where I learned everything in local languages. And then I moved to this big town called New Delhi, which is the capital of India. And that is when I first got introduced to, okay, everything has to be in English. You need to learn the second language. And that's when I picked up the second language. But it was a journey. And then I think my inclination growing up was to always, I was fascinated by space. I remember in high school, in the summer vacations after high school, my dad bought me a book called The Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. And that really mesmerized me about what space is and what astrophysics is and what these physicists do. So I actually got galvanized by that and started thinking about how can I build a career in space. Now, back in the day, there was only one employer. There was no Elon Musk, so nobody was building SpaceX, et cetera. If you wanted to be in aerospace or you wanted to do anything around that, you needed to work for NASA or something like that. And it was fun, but I decided to pivot in my third year of engineering and start my own company. I was bitten by the so-called entrepreneurial bug at that time. I was fascinated about what was happening in the market. And by the way, this is all back in India. So I'm reading this information from Silicon Valley secondhand. I'm not here, but I was always inspired by how a small idea backed by a bunch of believers can go on to change the world. And that idea galvanized me to start taking some risks of my own as well. So in my third year of engineering, I took a little bit of sabbatical to build a company. It didn't go anywhere, but it was good learning. I always tell people that your failures will teach you more than your successes will. And that was a great learning for me as well. And that honed the hustle in me, the ability to lead with them when there is a lot of ambiguity. All of that stuff that a founder typically faces when they start a company is what I learned during that time. And then once I was bitten by that, I was always looking for what do I do next, now that I've wrapped up my company. And by the way, when I wrapped up my company, my mom was very happy. She's like, okay, you got a stable job now. I got a job at Microsoft. She was very happy about that. She's like, I don't know, this startup thing, whether it'll work out or not, but now you're at Microsoft, things are good. And I learned a lot at Microsoft as well. One of the best early jobs you can get back in 2003, 4, 5, when you come out of college and you're like, all right, I can learn a lot from this company. And I did a lot of learning. And as part of that, I came to the US. And since then, I have been in Silicon Valley. And all I would say is that it's been the only genius thing I've done in my career is to come to Silicon Valley. The rest is everything happenstance. So it's been fun coming over here and meeting with great founders, working with really great employees and building a career here.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought that was super cool. So you tried entrepreneurship when you were younger. I'm curious, have you already figured out that your strong suit is product, or how did that evolve into your product career?
Yeah, I think in my career, I was always galvanized by the idea of the different things that need to be solved to make a product or a business successful. So I started in engineering, but slowly and slowly, I started gravitating towards understanding what marketing is and the role that marketers play in making a product successful. And by the way, just to be very clear, in Silicon Valley, there is a myth that all it takes is, just great engineering. Yes, that is an important element of a product success, but it takes a set of highly talented, dedicated, cross-functional partners across marketing. And if you have sales, that too, PR, product management, engineering, design, data science, all of them to collectively build great products. And what I found early on in my career was that amongst the center of this collaboration, PM plays a big role. So in 2007, I transitioned from engineering into product. And since then, I've been in product. It has suited my personality. It has suited what I truly enjoy and gives me energy, which is looking at problems from all angles and collaborating with different specialists like marketers or PR people or product managers and engineers and designers to come up with the right solution for the customer. And that junction where all of these things collide and then the magic happens, that is the place that I enjoy the most. And that's where I think product managers find them most often, in that sweet spot. So since then, I've been in product management.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say, I think compared to normally people who coming from an engineering background, I think you're super articulate and like really, it seems like a really social person. And I'm curious about what kind of skills did you constantly trying to learn to get better at, to be good at like your job as an entrepreneur or your job working at a big tech company?
Yeah, happy to answer this. And this is one of my constant focus areas for the last 10 years, but I've tried to constantly be aware of what should I grow into? What should I learn? What should I improve on? And what I've found is this interesting junction. I call it the yin and yang of personal growth. And let me explain what I mean by that. I find that it's easier for people, including myself, to pick up a skill. For example, you want to learn coding, you want to learn Python, how to code in Python, maybe you can pick that up by putting in enough effort and putting in enough dedication. And you can build that skill. But I think what I've learned is that over time, the real success differentiator for me was managing the yin and yang of my own personality. So let me explain that a little bit, what I mean by that. I believe if you want to truly be a founder or build a company that changes the world, you got to have a little bit of overconfidence. Because if you don't have that, you're going to be dismayed by all the obstacles you're going to get into. For example, there'll be more failures than successes. And if you don't have that a little bit of overconfidence in your own abilities to go still pursue that in the face of everybody telling you it's not going to work, you're not going to be a great successful founder, in my opinion. But at the same time, that same exact founder, that same exact executive also have to depict something which is exactly the opposite of it, which is humility. Because if you're not humble enough, you're going to be living in hubris. You're going to be thinking about everything that's in your head. So how do you, as an executive or a founder or an employee of any career stage, how do you manage these yin and yang personality traits has been a great revelation for me as well, growing in the last 10 years. And I constantly look at, okay, how do I manage this confidence that I can change the world, I can build something amazing, with the humility that is required to know that you can be wrong, with the humility to understand there are other perspectives that could be better than yours. And I think that's my constant journey as an individual, that how do I balance that yin and yang? I don't have a playbook for that, but I think I'm getting better every single day. I'm getting better every single day by having that balance.
That's so philosophical. I feel like sometimes you have to be really confident at what you do, but also be humble enough to really listen to your customer and then like actually learning what problem you're solving. And I feel like this is so important. I agree with exactly what you said. So you had a great career. You worked at many iconic companies. I assume a lot of times you probably will consult with other people about your ideas, and like who is on your personal board of advisors when it comes to career development?
Yeah, great question. I think the number one person on that list is my wife. My wife is my best friend, and my wife is also probably my best advisor as well. And there are more people as well, I think. But let me start there, and then I'll add more. So I think one of the best decision, or the biggest decision one has to make, at least in my perspective, is who you spend the rest of your life with. And I think I won the lottery ticket on that. I won the lottery ticket in the sense that my wife is a great mentor, a great coach, and a great partner, a thought partner in how we think about things. So I always go to her. When I took the Airbnb job, I wasn't sure if I should take that. And I went to her and had a long conversation with her, and she helped me think through what truly matters to me and why the job will be the great job. Same thing with the Coinbase role as well. So that's one big board of advisors from me. She advises me on all things from how to raise our kids and how to be a good dad, all the way to what job I should pursue. So she's played a big role. The other is I have a mentor as well who I've worked with for many years, and he has helped me think through the growth trajectory of mine as well, like personal growth trajectory, where I want to grow People always talk about what is your single thing that you're trying to optimize for in product land. I have a similar saying for my personality as well, which is the single thing that I'm trying to optimize for is to be the fastest learner in the room. And what I mean by that is if I'm optimizing for that aspect, I'm constantly growing and I'm constantly seeking opportunities that'll challenge and grow me even further. So this mentor of mine is a great person to go to, and he pushes my buttons sometimes as well to make me feel like, okay, am I thinking about this from the right way or not? And having a person that you confide in, having a person that you have trust in, and you can be vulnerable is a big asset in my opinion. So yeah, between my wife and this mentor, I've been very lucky to have the right set of people, or board of advisors rather, who will help me continue to grow.
Yeah, totally. Is your wife also in tech? Does she
Yeah.
like, I mean, how do you kind of pick the board of advisor? Like, what characteristic do you look for, and how do you kind of build that relationship with them?
I think for me personally, I've always been attracted to the opposites. What I mean by that is, like, my wife and I are completely different. She's not an engineer. I'm an engineer. She's not in product. I'm in product. She is in Silicon Valley, but she was born and raised on the East Coast in New York. And then she moved over here after we started dating and got married. So she brings that East Coast personality as well, which is very different than the West Coast personality. So if you ever meet us, we are kind of same, but more or less we're opposites, and the opposites amongst us attract each other. And I think that's the same thing I've found in my friends. That's the same thing I've found in the mentors I'm looking for. And I think my selection criteria has been what kind of energy. I'm a big seeker of energy. Let me explain this concept as well. So I organize my day around energy. So when I wake up in the morning, I have a set routine. I will do a certain set of activities, from working out to taking certain types of meetings in the morning, to taking certain types of meetings in the afternoon and evening. And I like to manage my energy. And energy has been a big source of how I've managed my resiliency as well. I mean, when you work at Airbnb, Coinbase, Instagram, etc., these are hyper growth companies. And if you don't self-regulate your own energy, you're not going to thrive and you're not going to survive. And that's at least my belief. And so I focus a lot on managing energy. So when I look at whether it's friends or a partner or a mentor, it's a very similar thing, which is I'm looking for that energy of connection, the energy where we can both be vulnerable with each other, where we can be honest and direct with each other. I don't want people who will BS me or will say stuff on my face, but say something else behind me, because I'm a very direct person as well. So I'm looking for those people as well. In terms of beyond the energy piece, you just have to click with that person. You just have to find who that person is. And I always tell people this, like everybody has this thinking, which is, hey, tell me a bullet list of things I should look for in my mentor, or tell me how to do X. And they expect you to give them like a checklist. Okay, look for this, look for this, look for this. What I've found in my life is it's very hard to describe great things in bullet points. You have to experience greatness to understand what greatness even means. And I think that is an incredibly important piece. So a lot of my answers, as you will notice, I am unable to tell people, even people who reach out to me for career advice, etc., is how to prescriptively do something, because I don't have a checklist. I don't have a do X, Y, and Z, and you will get that outcome, because I always believe great things can only be experienced and learned. So it's the same analogy over here. You got to spend time with that board of advisor, understand who they are, understand how the energies between you and that person interact, and how honest and direct they will be with you when you need that advice as well. And from a functional and domain perspective, I rarely look for that. My mentor is actually not even from tech, and they advise me on things because they've seen life beyond tech, and they've helped me stay grounded beyond tech. Because in Silicon Valley, for that matter, in any industry, you can have a lot of hubris in your head, because you can have a lot of echo chamber kind of an environment where everybody's saying the same thing. And I feel like you miss out on the opportunity to grow. So I've intentionally chosen an advisor or a mentor who is outside of Silicon Valley, who's seen great scale, great successes, and can help me understand my blind spots, things that I'm not even aware of that I should be looking for.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I feel like when I think about mentors, I normally just pick whoever have the career that I really want to achieve, or someone who is quote unquote similar to me. I guess like I didn't really trying to find someone who is like in the completely opposite. And like today, you really brought up a really good point that you need to seek people who are in a different space to basically like show you your blind spot. And I think that's super important. And speaking of like building a great product, you work at so many different companies that they're all iconic companies and have really iconic products like Microsoft, Yahoo, Instagram, Airbnb, and now Coinbase. How do you learn about an industry really fast to build a successful product? Or, what's the differences or similarities when it comes to creating a successful product in different sectors?
Yeah, I think I've been very lucky to have had a chance to work with some incredible founders. I joined Instagram with, I think it was less than 100 employees, if I'm not wrong. Very, very tiny. And by the way, when I say 100 employees across the company, not just in engineering, product, and design. So it's a very small company. And I got a chance to work with Kevin's sister, Mike Krieger, during those times. And I learned a lot there. With Brian Chesky at Airbnb, I got to learn a lot from him. I would say a lot of my product thinking is probably influenced more by Brian Chesky than anybody else that I've worked with in my life. And now I'm at Coinbase, where I work with Brian Armstrong and Surajit and a bunch of other folks as well. And I'm learning constantly around there. I think there are a couple of things that I've always found helpful when I've taken a new job. One is you got to start with a mindset that you are going to have to learn a lot. There are two options you can take when you're an executive. You can show up at a company and say, hey, look, I've done this at X, Y, and Z. And let me show you how it's right? Because I've done it before, right? And that, I think, is a failed strategy. I think the best strategy is to come in with an open mind and try to be a sponge who can absorb all the nuances of every industry. While it is true that we are all in Silicon Valley, while it is true that we all are building tech companies, but there are nuanced differences that dictate each industry and also define the company culture that you are in. So that's number one priority in my head, is that I go in with a mindset that I'm going to learn with an open mind. And of course, I'm going to bring my toolkit as well that I've honed over many years at these other companies to the problem at hand. But I think that's very, very important. The other is finding in that company what I call the source of truth people. So in every company, there are these experts. There are people who've done really well in those companies, in those industries, and have a lot of information. And I like to just spend inordinate amount of time with them in those places. So I've done that successfully. Within the first 3 months, I'll just attend every meeting, read every PRD, read every strategy doc, understand all those things and be naive enough to ask questions. Oftentimes, the biggest mistake you can make when you join a company as an executive is like, you don't ask all the right questions. So understanding that is incredibly important as well. And when it comes to product management, I can go on this, but there's a lot of things I've learned, and I'm happy to share my lessons and what I've seen to be working.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like the point that you mentioned that even you're really senior, you have done the similar things in various different companies, but you still having like the learning mind in you. So like essentially you have to put yourself into the position that to expose yourself to the knowledge in that industry and then chatting with people who are other experts in that industry. I'm curious about like when it comes to product or building a successful product, PMing is literally the hottest job. And I think from our private conversation, you've worked with a really iconic product leaders like Lenny. Curious about like, what do you see as like the core of the job? And someone like myself, I was in an engineering background. So how do if we all want to work in product, like what are some core things that we need to learn? And essentially, if we want to work in product, how do we kind of prepare ourselves? There are so many product school, but I don't know like how helpful it is to actually learn the essence of it instead of like the tactics of interviewing skills.
Yeah, I think there's a huge interest in product management. By the way, 10, 12 years ago, like 2003, 4, 5, product management wasn't that cool of a job. Now I think it is becoming a cooler job. So lots of things to share over here. So first and foremost, let's start with what is the role of product. I think in Silicon Valley, broadly speaking, there are two schools of thought. Broadly speaking, there are many nuances around, but broadly speaking, there are two schools of thought. One is the mini CEO school of thought, which says that you're the mini CEO of the product, which means that every decision is made by you. You are like the CEO. The problem with that school of thought is that I don't think that school of thought scales, in my opinion. And for many reasons. A couple of them are nobody reports to you, so a CEO, everybody reports to, and you can fire somebody if you wanted to, right? You can't do that as a product manager. You lead through influence. You don't lead through authority. There's a big difference. And also it creates a culture where it feels like all decisions must be made by PM. And the funny thing is PMs are generalists. They're not specialists. And if you want them to make hard decisions, you're probably going to end up making equally bad ones as you would make equally good ones. The other school of thought on the other side of the spectrum is this. Well, here's what design does. Here's what engineering does. Here's what marketing does. And everything in between that's white space is what PMs do. Right? I've heard that statement as well. Like someone drew this circle for me. There's a circle for design, there's a circle for engineering, there's a circle for marketing, and everybody else, that PMs do everything else in between the white space. I think that's also a problematic school of thought, in my opinion, because if your job definition is by virtue of what others don't do, then you don't have a job definition. You don't really know what you're supposed to do. So these two extreme schools of thoughts I've heard a lot about, and I don't subscribe to either one of them. I think the reality, as always in life, is somewhere in the middle. They're never on extremes. And what is the middle here? I think the real way to think about this is that, in my mind, product managers are first and foremost working backwards from the customer's need and are championing those needs. And let me explain that a little bit. And this is something we talked at length at Airbnb during the product management onboarding. By the way, when product managers will join on board, will onboard at Airbnb, I'll do a session with them to say, here's how Airbnb builds products. And this will be one of the top things we'll talk about, is when that great product managers always work backwards from the customer. And our customers generally don't know what they need. That is not their job. They just know that they have a problem. And our job is to then figure out how to solve that problem for them. And there are many ways to skin the cat, meaning you can talk about concepts like jobs to be done framework. You can talk about problem solution framework. There are many ways to solve that problem. But at the end of the day, your job is to identify the right customer problems that we should focus on and then prioritize the work around that. And that is the big role that PMs play. The other thing that PMs do, in my opinion, is what I call influence without authority. So I think the closest, probably why I ended up being in product, is because as a founder, one of my roles was to also influence people to believe in the mission and the vision that I have, and then bring them along in that journey. And I think that's a skill set that I've successfully transitioned into my product role as well, is where there's a vision, there is a belief in that vision, and my job is to influence others as well to believe in them. Not just to be clear, it is not just the PM's job to do that, but predominantly a lot of that burden falls on the PM as well, to bring across a bunch of talented individuals from different teams, different organizations, to believe in that mission and pursue that outcome for the customer as well. So I think those are broad strokes. I think we can go into details as well, but broad stroke, I would say that's how I would view the role of a product manager, which is not a mini CEO, which is not something that others don't do. Hence, you do kind of an analogy as well. And I think the most successful product managers that I've interacted with, whether at Instagram, Airbnb, or at Coinbase, etc., have been the ones who've taken this job very seriously. And there's certain traits I look for when I'm hiring product people. One is unconstrained thinking. Oftentimes, the argument in Silicon Valley is like, okay, what can we do? Well, we can do this because we have X, Y, and Z constraint. And Brian Chesky taught me this idea that, you should always work backwards from an ideal end state first. The general thinking is, let's work forward from an MVP. We have a high level vision. We have one slide for that vision. That's pretty much it. Now let's talk about the MVP. And the immediate reaction of many PMs is, all right, how many resources do I have? How much time do I have? What can I build in that time, right? And that's the general thinking you will see. But what Brian taught me was that you want to work backwards from an unconstrained vision first. Challenge all assumptions that you have today. Assumptions of your technology stack, assumptions of how many people you have, assumptions of time. And first and foremost, to me, craft a vision of what's possible. What do we want to create for our users? The ideal end state vision. And I think Brian gets that because he came from an industrial design background, and you design the ideal product experience first, and then you figure out how to ship it later. And I think that's an incredibly important piece. So I'm looking for PMs who thrive in unconstrained thinking. And they start with an unconstrained world. The second piece I look a lot for in PM partners that I work with, or whether it's in engineering design, but mostly in PM as well, is can they operate both in the ideation and scaling phase? So I've learned in my career that the ideation phase is a different skill set than a scaling phase, And some people are really good at the ideation phase, but they suck when it comes to scaling. And some people are really good at scaling, but 0 to 1 is like very hard for them, right? So I think finding people who can tread that boundary is very exciting for me. And when I find that unicorn person, I'm like, all right, let's come work for me, and we'll work together to build incredible products together.
That's just such a great framework to think about it. And I really like what you said about like a product person could be like building a product at the ideation phase, but wouldn't be able to build it at the scalable phase. That just brings a really good point, because I think to create one product for a niche group of people is not as hard as like creating something that's like really scalable, everybody use it. What is the differences in the job between like a ideation product management phase to the scalable phase? Like how do you test out if a product is going to be scalable?
I think you're hitting on two different concepts, and maybe I can touch on both of those things. So one is what we used to call at Airbnb, do things that don't scale at first concept, and then scale them later. So let's talk about that. And the other is this idea of it, that now that you're in scaling phase, what kind of skills, what kind of mindset, et cetera, you need to have to scale things. So let me start with the first one, which is do things that don't scale at first. So one of the things that Brian Chesky was taught early on, I think for someone at Y Combinator, which was
Paul Graham,
Paul Graham, I
things
believe,
don't scale. Yeah.
right? Do things that don't scale at first. And many people take that principle and say, oh, that's an operations optimization principle, meaning hire a bunch of operations people, they'll do some manual stuff. And that principle only applies to building products that have operation elements to it. I think that's a mistake. I think if you think about it, that principle also applies to software products. And let me explain why. So if you think about the ideation phase, you have to think unconstrained first. That's the principle that we follow. Now, when you think about unconstrained first, if you limit the selection criteria to only ideas that you already know how to scale, you're going to limit your vision of what is possible. Right? So I think it was very clear back in the day that Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia could do photography for a host in New York City. So they can put their profile photo on the home photo inside on Airbnb.com, but it wasn't clear to them how they're going to scale that service around the world. Now, if they, at that point in time, they would have made a decision saying, oh, we're not going to entertain this idea today because we don't yet know how to scale something, they would have lost the battle very early on. So the key in ideation phase is to think unconstrained, is to not have a selection criteria that says, oh, I don't know how to build something at worldwide scale on day one. And as a result, I will not even consider that idea. Instead, you want to open up all your ideas to all possibilities. I'll give you an example. When I was at Airbnb, we were trying to build lots of physical products. You know, what I mean by that is Airbnb has software products, but it also has physical products. When you stay in the home, Airbnb's product doesn't end when you put your phone down and the software is gone. It actually, in fact, I would argue, starts when you step foot inside that home. And the experience that home gives you is also the product of Airbnb. So we have this idea at Airbnb, which was software experience and then the offline experience. And that's an important piece. So we were building a lot of offline products in my Airbnb Plus GM role, where we were entertaining the idea of what would it look like to build a lounge where people, before the check-in happens, let's say your flight is at 6 a.m., your Airbnb home is not open till 3 p.m. What do? Right? Why don't we put you in a lounge that we have built, right? So I actually don't know how to build hundreds of lounges around the world. So what would I do? Well, I can discard that idea and say, well, that's a bad idea, right? Or I can say, okay, I know one thing, which is in LA, in this jurisdiction where a lot of hosts live based on data, I can actually build one lounge. You know, I know how to build one lounge, right? I can actually try that out. I can build the ideal experience around that lounge, send users to that product, the offline product, and get feedback around what that means, what it looks like for them, before I have figured out how to scale this to hundreds of cities around the world. And then I can, once that idea is proven, then I can try to iterate from that point onwards to scaling it over there. So I encourage product managers to actually do things that don't scale at first, try those things out, both in the software layer as well as in the offline layer. I'll give you an example. When I started Instagram shopping back in 2016, 2017, we had two operations people who would, instead of building the software, here's what we did. Because we didn't have time, we would have the merchants send us the photos and tell us where they want to tag the product. And there will be individuals who will actually manually tag that product. It wasn't an operations problem. I could have built the software on day one. We just didn't have the resources or the time to do that when we wanted to launch. So we did things that didn't scale at first, but then we figured out how to scale that. The second piece of the puzzle, I think, is what happens when you're now scaling. So Brian, in one of his podcasts, I think mentioned that he called it a left brain, right brain analogy. He said, you know, ideation and building products is like the left brain thing, scaling it like a more analytical, data-driven thing is on the right side of the brain, something like that. But I think I'll do something simpler. But what I would say is that when you're scaling products, you have to figure out a lot of things that generally you can ignore when you're doing the 0 to 1 piece, because you're trying to see a best experience liked by 100 users or loved by 100 users. And then you figure out how to scale that. And I think lots of new nuanced concepts over there, but the two that I like to talk about, one, and One is around the idea of knowing your target audience really well. So just because you build it doesn't mean they'll show up. You got to have when you're doing a scaling strategy, you got to figure out who you're going to target first, second, third, fourth, and you got to have a methodical way of saying which user I'm going to reach out to and which user I'm going to try to convert in that phase. So that's one principle to follow. Don't just launch it and hope people will come. Have a very targeted approach of attracting users of a certain type that you want to attract in each phases of that scale. The second thing is when you're going to scale, you're going to have systems breaking on you all the time. What I mean by that is, like when I was at Airbnb and even at Instagram, we were scaling so fast that things were breaking under the weight of that growth. That typically happens in a hyper growth company. So I think figuring out how your technology infrastructure stays one step ahead of your scaling strategy is incredibly important. Many PMs actually ignore that piece and just focus on scaling without realizing how far can you put the current technology infrastructure. And oftentimes you have to actually pause, rebuild some of the pieces that are choke points, and then scale as well. So these are the two examples that I wanted to bring. But as you can imagine, scaling products is a pretty lengthy topic, but these are good ideas to anchor around.
I have a question about, like, you mentioned about, like, you need to find a target audience first, right? For, let's say, for Airbnb launch, or say like for Instagram shopping, like who is your ideal audience? Is that like, maybe let's say Instagram shopping, are you primarily at the beginning targeting people aged between 25 to 35 years old women, or like how did you kind of figure out who is your ideal audience? Or like the Airbnb launch, some people would just go to, like, if they're traveling for pleasure, they could already plan something out before they go into the launch. What were some thinking behind identifying that target audience?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think both of these are two-sided marketplaces. And a good friend of mine, Lenny, wrote a lot of good stuff around how to bootstrap two-sided marketplaces. It's a great article and everybody should read it. But let's start with the basic assumption that you have a two-sided marketplace, where there's a supply side, somebody's selling something, and there's a consumer side, somebody's buying something. And Airbnb and Instagram shopping are exact examples of that. I think the first and foremost thing you have to figure out is who do you start with as a seed on the supply side? Like without any supply, there isn't any consumer, right? And that's my belief. I mean, of course, that belief is not accurate all the time, but majority of the time, there are marketplaces that have started on the supply side first, bootstrap the supply, and then scale. And as Lenny points out, there are some marketplaces that start on the consumer side and the supply came later on. But let's call it the 80-20 rule. And let's say most marketplaces have to start on the supply side. So it's incredibly important to understand who you're going to bring on board. So in case of Instagram shopping, we, for example, made a bet to go with some of the known brands as opposed to some of the unknown brands. We said, okay, we're going to start, I think W calls it the Goldilocks strategy, which idea is that you start in the middle as opposed to starting at the top extreme, meaning if you go with Macy's, it's going to take you many quarters to launch. If you go with a no-name merchant, no user will come. So Goldilocks strategy is starting somewhere in the middle where people are known enough and you can bootstrap that. So that was our strategy for Instagram shopping. For Airbnb Plus, as an example, we started with homes where the hosts were already exceeding what we wanted every host to exceed. So we looked at the marketplace and say, okay, let's start with hosts that we know are already delivering on hospitality, already delivering on great customer experience, and start to convert them into an Airbnb Plus host, because that is what is in demand from the consumer side. So you got to figure that piece out as well. The second piece I would say is you have to understand is on the consumer side as well, if it's an existing user base that you're targeting, so I'll use Airbnb Plus as an example, instead of going out of Airbnb and attracting a net new customer, what we did was we built Airbnb Plus homes, the supply side, and then we targeted existing users who have come to Airbnb, but either didn't find a home that fit them because the supply didn't exist, or had a bad experience with an Airbnb home, but now this product will serve that better. So we could have taken two stances. We could have said, okay, let's go and attract the person who never comes to Airbnb. That is a pretty daunting endeavor, and we want to get there. We want to have net new customers as well. But in the beginning, to bootstrap this system from a 0 to 1 perspective, we start with them. And once we had a product market fit in that realm, it was much easier for us to expand beyond that customer base to now start attracting net new users. For example, we actually started advertising Airbnb Plus homes on Google search and other places to attract somebody who'd never tried Airbnb before, but this product will appeal to them. So let's bring them over there as well. So you got to figure out, this is what I mean by a step-by-step scaling strategy, because the product you want to build will not appeal to everybody on the universe. And you got to be very clear about who are you building the product for, who you're going to go sell it to first or bring in to the system first. And once you have product market fit, continue to iterate from that point onwards to scale.
For sure. I have a random question. Let's say you and I are building a company that's like, let's say, masterclass for tech people, or like building like a tactical masterclass. Like, how would you go about a product like that? It's a marketplace. Top tech leader like yourself could sell their own courses on there. Like, how would you build something like this?
I think your podcast is already a masterclass, in my opinion.
You're a master, so I'm currently
your,
taking a masterclass from you. So.
Yeah, I think your interviewers are great. The people you interview are great experts in their field, and the audience that is listening to can learn a lot. So my biggest advice to you, first and foremost, would be by saying a masterclass for experts, you basically narrowed down your solution spectrum. So I would encourage, you don't have to build the same thing that masterclasses build and make it work for that. You can actually imagine that the format is completely different. It's not even a masterclass. Maybe it's a one-on-one session. I don't know. What I'm trying to say is that the first advice I'll give you is to approach this is like, while you're inspired by the masterclass concept, you should not pigeonhole your idea into the same format of what they have done. Maybe podcast is the new future. Maybe some other format like Clubhouse, where you join and pay for those clubhouses is the future. So that's one piece of advice I'll give you, is like, go beyond the solution that exists in the market, be inspired by it, but don't pigeonhole your solution in there. The second is, I think you gotta, again, going back to who's the user and what their problems are. So you got to ask the question, who am I targeting? Is it people who are coming to Silicon Valley or starting in product management or technology field, et cetera, or people who are more seasoned and experienced, and I'm taking them from 101 concepts to 301, 401, 501 kind of concept, and I'm getting deeper into these specific topics. So you can decide that which customer base you want to serve. If you want to serve the up and comers who want to enter into product or are early stage in product, different product concept, right? You got to build different type of content. But if you want to target someone like, let's say, a Brian Chesky or me or somebody else, whoever is an experienced person, I need a different type of content. My need is different than somebody else, right? That's the second piece. The third piece you have to be very clear is that what's in it for me? Meaning, why should I spend the limited hours that I have in my day, right, on your masterclass or your podcast or whatever it is, versus the millions of resources that I can go to and do it at other places as well. I mean, so that's a very important value proposition. What I call this is working backwards from the user, and you're writing the job to be done in their language. You're not saying that I want to offer this. Well, you're trying to understand what is the job to be done on behalf of the customer. So in my case, for example, you could argue the job to be done is that as a user, I'm getting started in product management, and I need help in figuring out how to establish myself and my knowledge base around it. That's the job that is written from the lens of the user, not written from the lens of the founder. I used to joke a lot about this at Airbnb. I used to say, what's the user problem you're trying to solve for a PM? And they will say, well, we're trying to increase searches per user per day, because people want to come here and they want to come here, and they want to increase the searches per user per day. But the funny thing is, no user will ever describe their problem as, oh, Airbnb increase my searches per user per day. Nobody's going to say that. That is not what the user problem is. The user problem there is a lot of choice, and help me find the house that is most appropriate for the vacation type that I'm taking, and will help me build memories around that. That is the user problem, versus searches per user per day. Searches per user per day is literally the way you're using a metric to measure how many searches are happening. But if you can find a way to outsmart search and just connect me to the right home without me even searching for it, that's an even better product, in my opinion, right? So sometimes those things are really important. So in other words, to wrap this up, what I would say is, try to understand what's in it for the user, figure out what you think are their jobs to be done, and then don't pigeonhole yourself into a predefined solution, because that will limit the space of visioning that you can do.
Yeah. Oh my God. I think you really changed the way how I think about these things. I love what you said about don't pigeonhole your solution like basically don't fake the problem, like trying to think about a solution to a real problem than thinking about what you want to produce or like what you want to put out there before really studying the customer and really studying what the problem is. So you started your role at like big tech companies and like you've worked at your own startups and then now you're the VP of Coinbase. You're in the management position now. So what's the differences between being a PM to, right now you're the VP of product?
I would describe this more as a spectrum. So
Mhm.
I always tell people this jokingly, but there's some truth to this joke, which is I get paid to use my intuition and judgment.
Mhm.
Because if every decision that I made could be solved with pure data, you don't need, right? You can just run your own analysis and say, what should we do, right? And the funny thing is, the worldview that I see is so complex and has so little data that you have to oftentimes look at data, but more importantly, have an intuition or a gut around where you want to go, and we have the conviction and the courage to make that. So that's how I would describe my role at both at Airbnb and over here, as well as like I get paid to make judgments and decisions based on intuition, because it's the world isn't that easy to construct just from pure math. There's a lot of ambiguity around here.
Mhm.
Now, when you're starting off in your career, I think we tried, at least at Coinbase, Airbnb, and I think even at Instagram and Facebook, if I remember correctly, you start in your career, you get a very well-defined scope, a very well-defined product charter, etc. You have a manager who is investing a lot in you and spending a lot of time with you. But as you grow in your career, you're expected to take on more ambiguous things. So for example, when you're going from IC 3, 4, 5, as you get more and more senior, you're beginning to take on problems that are not that well defined. And by the time you're a VP or somebody else, you're basically taking on problems where there's probably no solution that you can just see just by looking at it. You have a lot more ambiguity. So one dimension of this career growth is the dimension of ambiguity. Starting junior or early on in your career, you are very well defined scope. As you get more and more senior, whether it's product management, IC role, or management, things just get more and more ambiguous. The other is the role of autonomy, which is you're expected to operate as you get more and more senior in your career, more and more autonomously. Let me explain what I mean by that. That doesn't mean that I can't ask for help. Like I can always ask for. I can go to Brian Chesky, Brian Armstrong, anybody that I work with in my job, and ask for, hey, I don't know how to solve it. Like, let's just brainstorm this. That doesn't mean that I'm doing something wrong. What that means is that I'm expected, as I'm getting more and more senior, to be more and more autonomous. So ambiguity is increasing, autonomy is increasing. And those two things are pretty interesting if you think about it. There's less obvious answers, but you're expected to to operate in those less obvious fields pretty autonomously. So that's the one framework to think about these things. And as you get through your career, the scope of responsibilities also increases, meaning the surface area of the product you're touching is also larger. The number of users that are touching the surface area is also probably larger. So that's the way I think about a person's career trajectory, or career journey rather, in product management.
I really like that. Sometimes you can think about, like you want to brainstorm instead of like just be like, hey, I know how to do ABCD. I feel like that's a really humbling experience and like really humbling, like I guess like you're just like a really humble person to like actually do that. And then I'm curious about, after working with all these like iconic like tech leaders, what do you see as something that like you have absorbed into like your own like career routine? Like what do you see as like their qualities that you feel like it's good for your career growth and like for in general like succeed in tech?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of things I've learned with founders, working with founders. One of which is unconstrained thinking. I think one of the biggest traits of successful founders that I've found is that they have this uncanny ability to think in an unconstrained world. They can imagine a world devoid of the constraints that many people put on their own brains when they think about a problem space. And that's something that is very inspiring, but also very intimidating, right? If you think about it, one of the constant feedback that I get from my directs is that, your ideas are very big and they can sometimes be overwhelming because we feel like, I don't know if you can get there or not. So it's a constant thing that I try to embody is when I look at problems, when I look at what we're trying to do, creating a vision, I try to stay on the side of unconstrained thinking, big, bold vision. That doesn't mean that when you execute, you're not taking an MVP approach. Of course, you're going to start small and go big, but when you're envisioning the problem space, when you're envisioning what needs to get done, you're thinking unconstrained. So that's one thing I love about founders. They are able to think unconstrained. Other thing that I've learned is the idea of resiliency. I think we often in Silicon Valley, we don't talk a lot about individual traits as much as we talk about skills. I think skills like, coding, presentation, whatever that might be, hard skills. I'm talking more about resiliency, which is something that I've seen a lot in founders. So I'll give you Brian Chesky as an example. I consider him to be the Rocky Balboa of Silicon Valley. And he's been punched, him and his company has been punched many times. And he's always come back and say, all right, another round. Let's start all over again.
Oh
Let's do another round. And he's very inspiring in that. I remember when this is January, February of 2020, we're about to go IPO. We're all very excited. And then this thing comes, coronavirus, it hits the business really, really bad. And I still remember how Brian went through that. He probably went through crazy times as an individual, but as a leader, when he showed up with courage and conviction. And it was really inspiring to see that because everywhere around him, things were getting destroyed. Like he went to a podcast and said, it took me 10 years or so to build this company and 12 weeks to destroy it, kind of analogy. And because it really affected the business a lot. So what I've learned about these founders is that the idea of pushing through in the face of adversity is an incredible skill set. And many people give up. Brian Chesky used to tell me a lot, Sanchan, the magic is in the last 1%. Let's say you create a document. Let's say you create a product. You get to 99%. And then you give up. All right, that's good enough, right? And Brian used to push me and say, look, the last 1% is where magic's going to happen. Push yourself in the last 1%. And I think that ability to push in that last 1% is incredibly inspiring and is incredibly productive. You look at everything that Brian Chesky has done and Airbnb done, it is the magic of the last 1%. He doesn't give up until the last 1% is taken care of. So to summarize, I think unconstrained thinking, it inspires me and something that I try to embody a lot in my own leadership style as well, product management style as well. And then resiliency, which is things are not going to go as planned. But the fact that things are not going to go as planned doesn't mean you don't have a plan. You got to have a plan, and you can change that plan when things don't go as planned, but you got to have the resiliency to go through that and go through that last 1%. That is where the difference between victory and just so much success lies.
I have a question about resiliency. I think being resilient is very different than sticking with plan A and then just even plan A didn't really work out at the beginning. You just keep going with it. Let's say if I'm building a masterclass and if I invite you as my master, and then if I ask you to do a 30 hours of recording or something, you would think I'm crazy, right? At this point, would you say I should keep pushing to a problem or thinking about some other solution to solve the problem? What is resiliency to you? Also, is resiliency could be trained, or is it something that just comes to 5 people in the world?
I think there are two aspects here. One is when to know that you should pivot and do something else. And the other is, while you're still pivoting, do you have the resiliency as an individual to continue to pivot? So I think those are the two dimensions on which I can talk about. One is, how do you stay grounded and humble enough to know that what you're working on might not work out? And then you pivot and change and go in a different direction. The other is, many startups did not succeed with the first idea they came up with. They had to pivot many, many times. What many founders who did succeed had was the ability to persist through those pivots many, many times. And it's the same story with Airbnb as well, or for Instagram, or for Coinbase for that matter. And I'm pretty sure same story for many other successful companies where founders kept trying things out. They didn't work out. They didn't give up. And in spite of that, because of their resiliency, their determination, they kept going through it, and eventually they found success around that. So I will separate the two concepts in there. I think when to know to pivot versus keep pushing, it's a $1 million question. What I mean by that is, it is a very hard thing. And just like I mentioned earlier, I can't show you what great looks like. You have to experience it. I can't write a few bullet points to say this is what a great spec looks like, or this is what a great memo looks like. I remember in one of the letters that Jeff Bezos wrote, he said, when executives join Amazon, there's no memo that describes how to write great memos, because you have to feel and experience what a great memo looks like. So what he does is it makes them sit through many memo meetings And by the end of that stuff, they're like, oh, that one was a great memo. This wasn't a great memo. So that's experiential learning in many regards. So I think going back to the same thing, I think this is $1 million question because there is no playbook to decide when to quit, when not to quit. What is important is what I mentioned earlier. How do you separate your own hubris from and humility to figure out who you're listening to? So this goes back to the idea of who are your board of advisors, whose advice you trust, right? So I think as an example, during the coronavirus time, Brian Chesky went to many of his respected people, including Obama and many of the people in the board of directors as well, to seek advice, because you don't know what you don't know. And to be honest, there is nobody who knew how to navigate coronavirus. No company knew that, right? We all had to invent that as we were going through that. So I think it boils down to whose advice you trust, who are your trusted advisors to decide what to do. How humble you are to look at what the signal the customer is giving and accept it. Right. That is also an important piece. Now, that cuts both ways. I've seen many people push through that, even in spite of customer rejection, until they found the right customer who loved the product they were building. So a long way of saying to answer your question is like, it depends. There's no science over here. There's an art and science element over here. And it literally boils down to a couple of things you can do for yourself, which is how do you round off your unknown unknowns through mentors and advisors that you trust, and two, how humble you can stay to separate your own hubris from reality and be able to persist through that.
Yeah, totally.
Great.
One question is, what's a typical day look like for you as either the GM of Airbnb or the VP of Coinbase? And like when you first get to a job, how do you understand I wouldn't say the problem the company is facing. You are hired to give them a solution on product, right? Like how do you quickly realize like what's your scope of work, and then how do you kind of set your KPI for yourself and your team?
I think the first and foremost thing when you show up in any new role is to understand the culture. I always believe in this, which is everybody has access to the same information, but the view they see is determined by the lens they hold in their hand. And what I mean by that is every company has a lens called culture. And when they look at the world, they look at that world from the lens of their culture as well. So my number one priority is to spend time with the founder, spend time with the other executives, spend time with my own team and cross-functional partners, and literally understand how things get done over here. What is the culture like? What do we value? What do we don't value? How do we solve customers' problems? And I'm more interested in that journey than anything else. The other thing I would say is my personal day, like I mentioned to you, I like to structure those things around my energy zones. So I will start off by meeting with customers. So I've met a lot of customers since I joined Coinbase. The same thing I did when I joined Airbnb as well. I'll give you an example. Because Airbnb's product is an offline product, dog fooding that product meant that every Wednesday night, I stayed in an Airbnb home. So what I will do is I'll book the Airbnb home. Every Wednesday night, I'll go and stay in an Airbnb host's home, because if I wanted to dog food the product, I needed to do that. It wasn't a software product only. I couldn't just dog food it on my phone. I actually had to live in those places to understand, stay in those places to understand what that product is like. So what I like to do whenever I take a new job is like dog food the product. And in case of Airbnb, that was a physical home. In case of Coinbase, it's a software product. So it's relatively easier to dog food that. So meeting with the customers is incredibly important. And I'll spend a lot of time over there. And then over a period of time, I will figure out what the strategy is. I also am not the kind of person who comes in and changes everything on day one without first getting the full context around that. So I'll spend a lot of time understanding that as well, and then work with the team to come up with the right strategy.
Yeah, I really love that you're talking to the customer. Like multiple people said it in my podcast. Like they all said the same thing about like really listening to your customer. And curious about in terms of like competitions, like there's so many people are mocking off like Airbnb or like Coinbase like product. Curious about how do you view competitions, or I guess like the Instagram shopping experience is probably got mocked the most when it comes to like your competitor copying your feature. What's your mentality on that?
Yeah, I think that there are many ways to build products. I have a slide on this that I presented in my interview at Airbnb, which is as a product leader, how do I build products? And I had a slide that I actually put down different ways of thinking about it. The first way to build products is to look at your competition and just do everything that they're doing. I call it the feature neutralization strategy, which is, okay, XYZ has this feature, let's go build that feature, right? And I think that's one way to build that product, not the one that I advocate. The other way to build that product is to build it based on certain internal metrics. For example, revenue, right? Well, our job is to increase our revenue. Hence, the product we're going to build is all about revenue optimization, right? As an example. That's also a valid strategy, but not a very interesting strategy in my opinion. I think the best way to build product is what I learned at Instagram, which is literally obsessing over the customer's job to be done. I think one of the things that Mike Krieger and Kevin Systrom did was like stayed laser focused on that aspect. It's like just stay focused on the customer. So to answer your question, I think I'll definitely read about the competition and what they're doing and how they're doing things in a TechCrunch article or whatever that is. But there is no optimization. There's no activity that I'm doing to constantly look at competition and figure out what they're copying versus what we should copy from them. Because that is, in my opinion, personally, is not the right strategy to build great products.
Yeah, wow. I like that you put them into two ways of thinking, like either you copy all of them or like, I feel like this is such an interesting way to think about things. How do you kind of like learn from someone, but also like, do something that's like right for your company?
The thing that I've found very interesting is that the reason why companies eventually win is because they marry their superpowers with their strategy. Let me explain that for a little bit. Every company has certain superpowers. For example, when I was at Instagram, we had some superpowers, one of which was visual communication platform, right? That was a superpower, right? When we are at Airbnb, we had a superpower that our way of building products, which was obsessive over the last 1%, was a competitive advantage or a superpower that Airbnb brought to the table as well. So you want to have a strategy that is a winning strategy, and the combination of that strategy plus your superpowers is the unique thing you're creating to build the product. Let's take a couple of examples here. I mean, you can take any music streaming company, right? There's so many of them. Like Google is doing. YouTube has music, Amazon has music, Spotify has music, etc. But they all are bringing their superpowers in the execution of the strategy that they have chosen. Right? Everybody has a lot of selection, but the way that selection manifests is through the lens of their superpowers, right? And I think that is that combination of a unique strategy, which, by the way, can be copied very easily, right? People can do exactly what you're doing. But what they can't copy is the unique superpower that you have. Every individual also has a very unique superpower. Every company has a superpower. So how do I define superpower? In case of a company, I define it as a certain set of unique combinations that only exist in that company. Right? That is something you want to bring to the market. I mean, otherwise you're basically saying, well, because X is doing this strategy, I'm going to do the same strategy. But what you want to say is that our strategies might be 80% the same, but what makes us unique is the superpower plus strategy combo that is so unique that nobody can bring to that market. And I think that's how you create winning products and winning strategies.
Yeah, I think it also ties to building your personal mode, like essentially just like figuring out what exactly is your core competency and then really double down on like what's good for you. Curious, like just like one small question before we jump into the 1 minute fire round is, if a founder is listening to this, or like if a founder is listening to this, what are some like tactical things they could do after our conversation to build a better product or improve on their career?
I think a couple of things I'll say. One is continue the unconstrained thinking. A founder's superpower is the unconstrained thinking, which is imagine an ideal scenario and work backwards from there. Imagine an ideal outcome for your customer and work backwards from there. Two is be ruthless about execution. I think one of the things that really separates the, so to say, the successful ones and not the successful ones is they're very ruthless about execution. Like I will tell you, like Brian Armstrong is one of the most amazing executionists that I've seen, because he is obsessively focused not just on the idea, but how to actually make that idea come to life. So don't just be in la la land in the ideas land. You got to come down from the clouds of ideas to actually put your energy, blood, sweat, and tears, so to say, on execution as well. And I think honing your execution skills are probably as important as anything else that you can do as a founder.
Absolutely. I love it. Thank you so much. And we're in the 1 minute fire round session. So what's your favorite book?
It is my product and business book would be Competing Against Luck. That's a really good book that everybody should read. It'll help you build great products, even though it's not about software products. It's a great book to read. My personal philosophical side of the house, basically what I've learned is that metaphysics is actually a thing. and there are many, many books. And actually, I would recommend Naval Ravikant's tweets. He does a really good job
Yeah.
of synthesizing amazing books that I've read in that domain very easily. So instead of reading 17, 20 books, you can just follow his tweets and videos, and you're going to learn a lot about philosophy of life and how to be great in life.
Yeah, that's so funny.
So even though
Which is
Naval is
also
not a
true,
book,
yeah.
I would still recommend him.
Yeah, I saw like people screenshot his tweet on LinkedIn as their LinkedIn post. So like sometimes I saw it. Yeah, the tweets are great. So who made the biggest impact in your career?
I think on a personal front, I think my wife, she has been very supportive. I always tell people you can't build great careers and have a great family unless you have a partner who supports you in that. So I think that person has played an incredible role. And then I'll give props to somebody who was my first manager in my career, Sashi, back in Microsoft India. And he fundamentally changed my trajectory as well, because he took me under his wings and taught me things that you would never, like he was a GM of the entire India office of Microsoft, but it took me, a newbie, under his wings and taught me a lot. So I still remember those conversations. They probably helped me the most in my first job, but I didn't know anything, but he believed in me and invested in me.
Yeah. Who would you invite to your dinner party?
I'll invite two friends of mine, Sanjay Raman and Dan Kim, because those dinner parties will be so much fun. You guys don't know them, but they are the funniest people alive, in my opinion. They're my friend circle. They both work at Airbnb with me, and I love having fun dinners.
Where can we find you outside of work?
You can find me in my home gym. I love working out. I have a Peloton. I have a full gym set up in my area, and when I'm not working, when I'm not spending time with my family, that is where I love spending time.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.